Section 12 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 8. The manner of life at Gidding went on after this without the least alteration, and Inglesant's position in the family remained the same. 2 or 3 days after, Mr. Thorne returned and had an interview with Mary Collett alone. She told him she had not thought of marriage with anyone, but had dedicated her life to other work. He attempted a flowing discourse upon the evils of celibacy, and managed to destroy by his manner much of the kindly feeling which Mary had conceived for him. He met John Farrar and Inglesant coming from the church, and Inglesant tried to exchange some kindly words with him, but he avoided conversation with him and soon left. Inglesant passed most of his time, for he was not quite so much with Mary Collett as before, in reading, especially in Greek, and in assisting some of the family in preparing the great book which was afterwards presented to Prince Charles. The influence of Mr. Hobbes's conversation wore off in the peaceful religious talk and way of life of this family. It was here that he had first obtained glimpses of what the divine life might be, and it was here alone that he felt any power of approach to it in his own heart. His love for Mary Collett, which was increased tenfold by the acknowledgment she had made to him, and which grew more and more every day that he spent at Gidding, associated as it was with all the teachings and incidents of these quiet holy days, made this life of devotion more delightful than can be told, and indeed made that life more like to heaven than any other that Inglesant ever lived. As he knelt in church during the calm hours of prayer, and now and again looked up into Mary Collett's face from where he knelt, he often felt as though he had found the beatific vision already, and need seek no more, so closely was her beauty connected with all that was pure and holy in his heart. In these happy days all pride and trouble seemed to have left him, and he felt free in heart from all self-will and sin. It was a dream and unreal doubtless, but it was allowed him not altogether without design, perhaps, in the divine counsel, and it could not be without fruit in his spiritual life. The long summer days that passed so quietly at Gidding were days of disturbance all over England, the king's friends and those of the Parliament endeavouring to secure the counties for one or other of the contending parties. Nearly the whole of the eastern counties were so strong for the Parliament that the king's friends had little chance, and those gentlemen who attempted to raise men or provide arms for the king were crushed in the beginning. But Huntingdonshire was more loyal, and considerable preparation had been made by several gentlemen, among others Sir Capel Beadle and Richard Stone, the High Sheriff, to repair to the king's quarters when the standard should be set up. Inglesant was waiting to hear from his brother, who had returned from France and was in Wiltshire with the Lord Pembroke, who had set in force the commission of array in that county. Inglesant would have joined him but for the close neighbourhood of the king, who might be expected in those parts every day. Accordingly, one afternoon, the king, accompanied by the prince, afterwards Charles II, and the Duke of Lennox, and by Prince Rupert, whom some called the Palsgrave after his father came to Huntingdon. Inglesant rode into Huntingdon that evening, and found the king playing at cards with the Palsgrave. The king received him graciously, and spoke to him privately of Father St. Clare, who had latterly, he said, been very active among the Catholics of Shropshire and Staffordshire, from whom he soon expected to receive large sums of money. He said the Jesuit had told him where Inglesant was, and that he intended on the next day to come by Little Gidding on his way, and should spend hours there, as he was very desirous again to see a place which had so pleased him, and of whose inmates he had formed so high an opinion from what he had seen of them. Inglesant slept that night in Huntingdon, but very early on the fine summer morning he rode out to Little Gidding to warn the family of the honour that was intended them. Accordingly, about noon, they saw from the windows of the house the royal party approaching at the bottom of the hill. The whole family went out to meet them to the boundary of the lordship at a little bridge that spans the brook. When the king approached foremost of all, they went to meet him, and kneeling down prayed to God to bless and preserve his majesty and keep him safe from his enemies' malice. The king rode up the hill at a foot-pace and alighted at the chapel, which he examined carefully, and was then shown over the whole house, being particularly pleased with the almshouse, for whose inmates he left 5 pieces of gold, saying it was all he had. He had won them from the Palsgrave the night before at cards. When he was come into the house, the great book that was being prepared for the prince was brought him, and he spent some time in examining it and admiring the prince, of which it was full, pointing out to the Palsgrave, who appeared to understand such things, the different style of each engraver. When he had sufficiently admired the book and walked about the house, admiring the pleasant situation upon the little hill, the sun beginning to go down, the horses were brought to the door, and the king and the rest mounted. The whole family, men and women, knelt down as the king mounted, and prayed God to bless and defend him from his enemies, and give him a long and happy reign. "Ah," said the king, raising his hat, "pray for my safe and speedy return again," and so rode away, not knowing that he should return there again once more in the very dead of night, a fugitive and almost done. When John Inglesant had said to Mary Collett that he was almost penniless, he had used rather a strong hyperbole, for at that time the sum of money his father had left him was almost untouched. Upon leaving London he had managed to get it transferred from the goldsmith with whom he had deposited it to another at Oxford, by a bill of exchange on the latter, as was the custom in transmitting sums of money in those days. This bill being now due, Inglesant decided on going to Oxford to secure possession of the money. He lodged at first at Mr. Martin Lippard's, a famous apothecary, but after a few days he entered himself at Wadham College, where he got rooms which were of great use to him afterwards when the court came to Oxford. No place could have been found which offered more to interest and delight a man of Inglesant's temperament than Oxford did at this time. It was still at the height of that prosperity which it had enjoyed under the king and Laud for so many years, but which was soon to be so sadly overcast. The colleges were full of men versed and intelligent in all branches of learning and science as they here then taught. The halls and chapels were full of pictures and of rich plate, soon to be melted down. The gardens and groves were in beautiful order, and the bowling greens well kept. The utmost loyalty to church and state existed. Many old customs of the Papist times, soon to be discontinued, still survived. One of the scholars sang the gospel for the day in hall at the latter end of dinner. The musical services in the chapels on Sundays, holy days, and holy day eves were much admired and the subject of great care. Music was studied deeply as a science antiquity, and every foreign country being ransacked for good music, and every gentleman pretending to some knowledge of it. The High Church party which reigned supreme were on excellent terms with the Papists, and indeed they were so much alike that they mixed together without restraint. No people in England were more loyal, orthodox, and observant of the ceremonies of the Church of England than the scholars and generality of the inhabitants. Every kind of curious knowledge was eagerly pursued. Many of the fellows' rooms were curious museums of antiquities and relics, and scarce books and manuscripts. Alchemy and astrology were openly practiced, and more than one fellow had the reputation of being able to raise spirits. The niceties of algebra and the depths of metaphysics were inquired into and conversed upon with eagerness, and strange inquiries upon religion welcomed. Dr. Cressy of Merton was the first who read Socinus's books in England, and is said to have converted Lord Falkland, who saw them in his rooms. A violent controversy was going on among the physicians, and new schools had risen up, who practised in chemical remedies instead of the old-fashioned vegetable medicines. The members of the university had put themselves into array in a posture of defence, for as yet there was no garrison at Oxford, and divers parties of soldiers were passing through the country, sent by the Parliament to secure Banbury and Warwick. The deputy vice-chancellor called before him in the public schools every one who had arms, and the recruits were trained in the quadrangles of the colleges and other places. Matters being in this state, late in October, in the middle of the week, news reached Oxford that the king had left Shrewsbury with his army, and was marching through Warwickshire on his way to London. The parliamentary army was following from Worcester, and was thought the two armies would soon engage. Numbers of volunteers immediately started to meet the king's army, many of the undergraduates stealing out of Oxford secretly and setting forth on foot. Inglesant joined himself to a company of gentlemen who had horses, and who, with their servants, made quite a troop. Some way out of Oxford he overtook a young undergraduate, the elder brother of Anthony Wood, afterwards the famous antiquary, who had stolen out of Oxford as above, and made one of his servants take him up behind him. They went by Woodstock and Chipping Norton, and slept the Friday night at Shipston upon Stour, and early the next morning obtained news of the royal army, which arrived under the Wormleighton hills in the evening of Saturday. The king lodged that night at Sir William Chauncey's at Ratole Bridge, some distance from the army, where Inglesant went late in the evening. These quiet woodland places, some of the most secluded in England, both then and now, so much so that it was said in those days that wolves even were found there, were disturbed by unwonted bustle these dark October nights, parties marching and counter-marching, recruits and provisions arriving. It was not known where Lord Essex's army was, but after it was dark it was discovered by the Prince of Wales's regiment, which had been quartered in 2 or 3 villages under Wormleighton Heights. The whole regiment was drawn out into the field, and remained there all night, provisions being brought to them from the villages, and news was sent to the king and Prince Rupert. At Sir William Chauncey's, Inglesant found the Jesuit and some of the other Catholic gentlemen whom he knew, for the number of papists in the royal army was very great. Father Hall was dissatisfied at seeing Inglesant and tried hard to persuade him to keep out of the battle, saying he had difficult and more useful work for him to do. But Inglesant would not consent, though he agreed not to expose himself unnecessarily. The Jesuit told him that his brother was with the prince's regiment, but counselled him not to join him, but stay in the king's bodyguard, which his place at court might well account for his doing. He enlarged so much upon the coming danger that Inglesant, who had never seen a battle, became quite timid, and was glad when the Jesuit was sent for to the king. Inglesant slept in a farmhouse not far from Sir William's, with several other gentlemen, for those were fortunate who had half a bed, and on the morning rode with the king's pensioners to the top of Edgehill. The church bells were ringing for morning service as they rode along. The king was that day in a black velvet coat lined with ermine, and a steel cap covered with velvet. He rode to every brigade of horse and to all the tertias of foot, and spoke to them with great courage and cheerfulness, to which the army responded with loud huzzas. An intense feeling of excitement prevailed as this battle, the first fought in England for more than a century, was joined. Numbers of country people crowded the heights, and the army was full of volunteers who had only just joined and had no idea of war. The king was persuaded with difficulty to remain on a rising ground at some little distance with his guard of pensioners on horseback. But Inglesant did not remain with him, but joined his brother in the prince's regiment under the Palsgrave, and rode in the charge against the enemy's horse, whom the prince completely routed and chased off the field. Inglesant, however, did not share in the glory of this victory, for his horse was killed under him at the first shock of the encounter, and he went down with him and received more than one kick from the horse's hoofs as they passed over him, rendering him for some time senseless. On recovering himself, he managed to get on his feet and cross the field to the royal foot, but unfortunately joined the foot guards at the moment they were attacked and routed by the parliamentary horse and foot. The Earl of Lindsay and his son were taken prisoners, and the royal standard was taken. At this moment the king was in great danger, being with fewer than 100 horse within half a musket shot of the enemy. The 2 regiments of his reserve, however, came up, and Charles was desirous of charging the enemy himself. Inglesant remained with a broken regiment of the guard, who retreated up the road, over the hill, along which the enemy's horse advanced, but the early October evening setting in, the enemy desisted and fell back upon their reserves. It was a hard frost that night and very cold. The king's army marched up the hills, which they had come down so gallantly in the morning. Inglesant remained with the broken foot guards and the rest of the foot, which were confusedly mixed together all night. The men made fires all along the hilltop to warm themselves, and gathered round them in strange and motley groups. Many of the foot were very badly armed, and the Welshmen especially having only pitchforks, and many only clubs. But Prince Rupert the next day made a descent upon Keynton, and carried off several waggon-loads of arms, which were very useful. The officers and men were mixed up together round the fires without distinction. As Inglesant was standing by one of them, stiff and stunned with the blows he had received, and weak from a sabre cut he had received on the arm, he heard someone who had come up to the fire inquiring for him by name. It was the Jesuit, who had given him up for dead, as he had met his brother, who had returned with Prince Rupert when he rejoined the king, and had learnt from him that Inglesant had fallen in the first charge. He had told him that Eustace had gone down into the plain to endeavour to find him, which surprised and touched Inglesant very much, as he suspected his brother of caring very little for him. Father St. Clair stayed with Inglesant at the fire all night, for the latter was too stiff to move, and made himself quite at home with the soldiers as he could with people of every sort, telling them stories and encouraging them with hopes of high pay and rewards when the king had once marched to London and turned out the Parliament. Inglesant dozed off to sleep and woke up again several times during this strange night with a confused consciousness of the flaring fire lighting up the wild figures, and the Jesuit still talking and still unwearied all through the night. One of the first men he saw in the morning was Edward Wood, whom he had helped on his way from Oxford. This young man had been much more fortunate than Inglesant, for he had come on foot without arms, and he had succeeded in getting a good horse and accoutrements. "You are much more lucky than I am," said Inglesant. "I have lost my horses and servants and all my arms, and am beaten and wounded, as you see, till I can scarcely stand, while you seem to have made your fortune." "I shall certainly get a commission," said the young man, who was only 18 and certainly was very much pleased with himself. "But never mind, Mr. Inglesant," he continued patronizingly. "It is your first battle, as it is mine, and you have no doubt learnt much from it that will be useful to you." It had been one of the principal parts of Inglesant's training to avoid assumption himself, and to be amused with it in others, so he took his patronage meekly, and wished him success on his return to Oxford, where he really was made an officer in the king's service soon after. Soon after he was gone, Inglesant found his brother, and with him his own servants, with an additional horse they had managed to secure, with which he replaced the one he had lost. and the next morning he rode with the Palsgrave into Kyneton, where they surprised the rear of the parliamentary army, and took much spoil of the arms and ammunition, and many wounded officers and other prisoners. But his wound being very painful, and being sick and weary of the sight of fighting, and especially of plundering, he left the prince in Kyneton and returned to Oxford, where he was very glad to get back to his pleasant rooms in Wadham. After the king had wasted his time in taking Banbury and Broughton Castle, he marched to Oxford with his army, where he was received with demonstrations of joy, and stayed some days. After the king had rested a short time at Oxford, he proceeded to march to London, but Inglesant did not accompany him. The blows he had received about the head, together with his wound, and the excitement he had gone through, brought on a fever which kept him in his rooms for some time. The Jesuit stayed with him as long as he could, but many other of Inglesant's friends at Oxford showed him great kindness. When he recovered, he found himself, to his great surprise, something of a hero. Though, as we have seen, few men could have done less at Edgehill than Inglesant did, or have had less influence on the event of the day, yet, as he had been in the charge of the prince's horse, and also in the route of the foot guards, and had been wounded in both, and above all was especially with the ladies something of a favourite, of whom no one objected to say a good word, he gained a decided reputation as a soldier. It was indeed reported and believed at Little Giddings that he had performed prodigies of valour, and had saved the king's life several times, and retrieved the fortunes of the day when they were desperate. In some respects this reputation was decidedly inconvenient to him. He was looked upon as a likely man to be in all foraging parties and in expeditions of observation sent out to trace the marchings and counter-marchings of the enemy. Now, as he was pledged to the Jesuit not to expose himself to unnecessary danger, these expeditions were very troublesome to him, besides taking himself away from the studies to which he was anxious to apply himself, and from the company of the leaders of both the churchmen and papists, to obtain the acquaintance and confidence of whom he still applied himself, both from inclination and in accordance with the Jesuit's wish. It was true, however, that in these expeditions about the country he formed several friendships of this kind, which might afterwards be useful. End of section 12.